Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back from another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, I may just be a simp, but this sounds suspect to me, and that's a meme of Fry from Futurama with his eyes squinted, and it's by a catalog curmudgeon. They said, it says the same people who lied about the source of COVID-19 and effectiveness of vaccines and social distancing and preventing transition want to regulate fake news and misinformation on social media. And I said, remember, when you can question it, it's science. When you can't, it's religion, I personally think, if the experts want to say whatever they want to say, they should be able to, but that doesn't mean you should be forced to obey by all their, rules. And I personally think, the government has increasingly shown for stuff like the Amazon files, the Twitter files, the Facebook files, that they can justify censoring you if you have a dissenting opinion. And I personally don't think that's very libertarian. I think we need as much free speech as possible, and I think you should be able to disagree with the official, whatever the official narrative is, and act accordingly. Then we have free market, as we know it, is not really about freedom, but about relinquishing state control from Freethinker78, and that's a self-post. And they said, a few paragraphs, but I'll highlight this one. Free market in the meaning of simple government regulations, really about the law of the jungle. Might makes right. This means the bigger you are, the more liberty you enjoy to do whatever you want. Whereas the smaller you are, the more you live under fear of the bigger entities. If there are no laws whatsoever to control the behavior of corporations, the most powerful corporations become the de facto governments, and they impose the rules of the market. And I said, in a lot of ways, that's how nature does work, though. Look at the food chain, for example. I do think that we should try and make life as fair as possible, but life is ultimately always going to be unfair to some extent. When you force everyone to be equal, it only leads to suffering. Just look at all the times communism/socialism has been enacted with that exact goal. I think we need to let each individual have their own sweet spot as long as they aren't hurting anyone else. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have the United States, if every state reflected its state subreddit. That's from Chad Muffin. And that's the picture is, it says Democrats 548 and Republicans 0. And I said, although they would probably outlaw the Republicans and the third parties as well, because nothing says democracy like a one-party state. I don't think the Republicans care too much about democracy either. They sued me off the ballot for state House of Representatives in 2022. But with that being said, I don't really think, I think the Democrats don't care about democracy either. And increasingly, they're being obvious about that, of how they're trying to take RFK Jr. off the ballots. And we'll get to that later. Then we have Alabama Supreme Court cites the Bible in classifying fertilized eggs as children from NewRepublic.com by Whittling Dan. And I said, at least it's not The Wire. And I linked to that. The Hawaii Supreme Court cited The Wire in its ruling on gun rights recently. The thing about the old days. And, yeah, I personally don't think he should be citing the Bible or The Wire or anything, any pop culture or cultural work. But ultimately, the courts do have the force on their side, and that's why I particularly don't really care for them, because they can just say whatever they want, and no one will hold them accountable for it, really, because they have the force of the state on their side, and that's why they have. So that's why I think that's why we need to nullify the courts and make our own laws and rules rather than just obey whatever the state says. Then we have wrong ethnicity, wrong ideology. The media doesn't care about kids getting shot unless it's politically convenient, from Aaron McIntyre on Twitter. And I posted that. And that was his reply to someone saying, why haven't they released the names of the Kansas City shooters yet? And some people said, oh, it may be because they're juveniles. And people say, what about Kyle Rittenhouse? That's how they can release his name. It just goes to show you that they care more about the narrative and using it to manipulate people rather than what actually is happening. I also linked to Relevant, and it's a clip from Family Guy about how, if you want the media to disappear, just mention black on black crime. The media only really cares about violence when it can be used to suit its agenda, like when it's white on black crime. They always love hyping up that, like they did with George Floyd, and that's not something that I particularly care for. The media's going to hype up what it hypes up, and increasingly I think people are catching on to that. And I think that's why it's good people are questioning the media and making their own sources instead of just listening to whatever the old sources were. Then we have, remember the Democrats, the party that's deeply concerned about democracy. NBC News headline, DNC files complaint over RFK Jr. Super PAC's efforts to put him on state ballots from Tom Woods on Twitter, and I posted that, and I said, I guess the democracy is only when only Democrats are on the ballot. It's in the name. And, the media probably only really cares because of RFK Jr. being a potential spoiler for Biden. I bet this is a common occurrence when it comes to the Uniparty, but we don't hear about it because it would go against the narrative. So the thing is that, I think, if RFK Jr. wants to use the super PAC to on the ballot, he should be able to. But, I think we need as many options as possible. But right now, they want you to have as few options as possible. They want you to have the red option or the blue option. And in some states like New York or Maine or Colorado, they may even take away the red option too. So, yeah. So that's why I think we need to support as many choices as possible rather than just have one choice. Then we have the pervasive influence of political composition on circuit court decisions from papers.ssrn.com by Patan 13. And, people are, people can say, oh, I separate my rulings from my ideology, but increasingly, people have shown that they can't do that. And that's increasingly why I think, just let everyone run themselves rather than have the state run them, because the state's going to always try and... There's no such thing as a politically neutral institution. I think I read that on Aaron McIntyre's Twitter account, they're always going to be biased to some extent, and that's why, you need to let people run themselves rather than let the state run them with their agenda and their biases. Then we have how politicians can draw fairer election districts the same way parents make kids fairly split a piece of cake from conversation.com by Patan 13. And, ultimately, all districts are going to be somewhat unfair, but ultimately, I think we should try and make them as fair as possible, and that's something that I think, we need to support when it comes to democracy. I personally don't think democracy is that libertarian at all, because it's increasingly, mob rule and tyranny of the majority, but, that being said, I do think we should try, if we are going to do it, I think we should try and make it as fair as possible. Then we have measles erupts in Florida school where 11% of kids are unvaccinated from arstechnica.com by Patan 13. And I said, it's a free versus safety issue. If you be like this or read an authoritarian nanny state like NY, and I linked to a tweet from Joshua Smith, and it was linked to an article. He said, New York moves to begin vaccinating children without parental consent. I don't think that's libertarian either. So the thing is, ultimately, you can choose to, I personally think, a lot of public health orders are overly authoritarian. I personally don't think you should shit in the street, so to say. But with that being said, I don't want to tell you that you can't do that, because as long as I do think you consider that a NAP violation. I personally would. But that being said, I don't like telling people even what to do when it comes to NAP violations, and that's something that I'm pretty passionate about. So I wouldn't do that. But if you are doing it, you probably aren't in the best place already. And if you want to justify it, that's ultimately on you. Then we have at Jordan S. Rubin, Alito is mad that jurors were struck for saying homosexuality is a sin, from MSNBC.com by Kage blah blah blah. And I think ultimately if the cases has nothing to do with homosexuality, I think they should be. I don't think they should be struck. But ultimately, it does come down to what the people in charge think. Then we have what kind of diversity is actually a strength from Common Sense Soapbox, and I posted that. And I said, agree with Seamus here, people love diversity, but only when it's their kind of diversity, otherwise people hate it. It's funny to me how a lot of people who market themselves as being the most pro-diversity suddenly hate it when it comes to diversity of opinion. Then we have the problem with right-wingers is that they believe all sorts of deranged conspiracy theories like Jewish space lasers, and I posted that, that's a self-post, and I said, now Russian space nukes, those are the real threat. I was just watching CNBC with my father, and that is legit what they were pushing. If you want a conspiracy to appeal to the DNC left, just replace Jewish with Russian, it works every time. So, ultimately, It's all just, I think most things are just probably media hype, and this is just another example of it. That's my thoughts there. Then we have Alexander Smirnov, FBI source accused of Biden lies linked to Russian intelligence from BBC.com by Kage blah blah blah. And I said, the Democrat who cried Russian acid is the modern boy who cried wolf. I personally think this guy could be a Russian asset. It could be from the Kremlin. But with that being said, the Democrats have already used that excuse so many times that no one really cares anymore. And that's kind of the moral of the boy who cried wolf. And that's my thoughts there. Then we have Hunter Biden's lawyers say prosecutors confused a picture of sawdust with cocaine from NBC News from Kage blah blah blah. And I said, I didn't comment on this one, but yeah, I definitely do think, that's kind of their agenda, and I definitely do think you probably have pictures of Hunter Biden with cocaine, so I don't think that'll be too hard to find, but maybe one of them has sawdust in it, so, this is just kind of their agenda. Hunter is obviously kind of on to all the drugs, so I don't think, this is that true, but, ultimately, the lawyers are assigned to represent him, so ultimately that's probably, they're doing their job. That's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Supreme Court won't review sanctions against pro-Trump lawyers who filed frivolous 2020 election suits from CNN Politics, and that's from Ninja Lover. And, I guess, if the Supreme Court doesn't want to do that, I don't think they should be forced to do that. That's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have non-Chinese citizen immigrants sworn in on San Francisco's election commission from NY Post, and I posted that, and I said, could you imagine if this was a Russian non-citizen? It'd be all over the front page of Russia interfering in our elections. The whole narrative is that Russia is interfering in our elections, even though China has historically as well. Look at the Chinagate stuff that I talked about in my Al Gore thread recently. Al Gore attended a fundraiser at a Buddhist temple in California that was funded in part by the Chinese government, and increasingly so. With that being said, the Russian appointment would probably have to be in a place that was in the DNC bastion, like SF Dearly and Tractional Right. With that, ultimately just goes to show you that people don't like foreigners interfering with elections unless it's okay unless the narrative says otherwise. So that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, why does it say MAGA? Doesn't do what you mean, right? Libertarian. That's from Frosty Slum, and that's a tweet from Boston Smalls. MAGA's country is a mess, and I don't know what to do. Americans, do you support rising minimum wages? Nah. Do you support unions? Nah. Make corporations pay what they owe? Nah. Make billionaires pay what they owe? Nah. Bipartisan border deal? Nah. Trump said no. Universal background checks? Nah. NRA said no. Cap insulin costs? No. Big Pharma said no. Do you fight climate change? It's a hoax. And it just kind of goes on and on. And, I don't agree with all that, but, ultimately, if people want to think that, they should be able to. And, I definitely do think, everyone does have an agenda, and they definitely see that when it comes to politics, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have finally one election. That's the self-post that I made. I said, just elected treasurer of my county Libertarian Party. Maybe I'll find where all the coke money the party supposedly gets is hidden. So, I did win an election last night, and, I was unopposed, but I just have a historical record of losing elections, so I do think, I'm glad to have won one. And I'm glad to, hopefully I'll be able to do the job. Then we'll have Constitution 101, the Supremacy Clause, from YouTube.com by Anarcho Federation. That's a YouTube video from 10th Amendment Center. And they added, one of the most twisted and abused clauses of the Constitution. Most people get it almost totally backwards. And I agree, we shouldn't be having the supremacy of the federal government, because that's just, I think we need the supremacy of the individual rather than that of the collective. And I think that's the libertarian position on the issue. Then we have the big invasion they want you to ignore from YouTube.com by Anarcho Federation. That's a YouTube video from 10th Amendment Center. And what most people give the word most people give the word invasion, and one constantly founders use in a way it's almost completely ignored today. And I think that's interesting, yeah. I definitely think, people, if they want to stand their ground against what they deem to be invasion, I think they should be able to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have the Revolution versus Unlimited Centralized Power, and that's a YouTube video from Anarcho Federation. Is that it's the 10th Amendment Center as well. And they said, taxation without representation, standing armies, suspending legislatures, and so much more. These were all symptoms of much greater underlying issue of the British claim of power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And I agree with that. Ultimately, we need to stand up against centralized power, and that's why I support decentralization and people making their own decisions rather than the state making decisions for them. Then we have Constitution 101, enforcement mechanism from it's another one from, I think, is that another from Brad Narco Federation. And they said, yes, there actually is an enforcement mechanism to keep the federal government from the bounds of the Constitution, but it has nothing to do with trying to convince the feds to limit their own power. And I ultimately think the biggest enforcement mechanism for the Constitution will be the people themselves. If the government violates the Constitution, it's the people's job to hold them accountable, not that themselves. And that's why we need to hold the state accountable when they violate the constitutional oath. And increasingly, I do see people doing that, but I don't think it's gonna be nearly enough to change anything. But increasingly, people are calling out on it, so I think that's good. Then I'd like to see it broken down by zip code too by Chad Muffin, and that's the charts they shared by distribution of household wealth in the U.S. by income group, and yeah, and that's from the FederalReserve.gov, and yeah, ultimately, a lot of the top 1% owns like a lot of the wealth, and ultimately that's just how life goes sometimes. Sometimes people are going to rise to the top and take all the wealth, and that's just how you have to cope with that. And hopefully, we just all need to survive. I personally used to sympathize more with the Occupy Wall Street movement. With that being said, so you can't just to take the wealth of people by force. If you want to justify that, by all means, I think you should be able to do so. But that being said, I personally do think that's ultimately wealth inequality is always going to be there, and by trying to make everyone equal, you're only going to make everyone worse off. Like whenever we try socialism or communism, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have unvaccinated Florida kids exposed to measles can skip quarantine. Officials say from arstechnica.com by Whittling Dan, and I said, I feel like the vast majority of Reddit political posts in the 2020s break down to one of three categories: Russia bad, Trump bad, Florida bad. Also, the Florida Surgeon General has a doctorate from Harvard. What happened to listening to the experts? Ultimately, I think I kind of more disagree from here too. With that being said, ultimately, I don't want public health to be justification for authoritarianism like it was during COVID, and that's something that I'm pretty passionate about. Then we have freedom for all means that people should be able to do stuff they disagree with or find immoral. And I said, and that's in self-posts that I made, in 1996, John McCain famously lobbied to ban UFC, calling it human cockfighting and leading to bans on it in 36 states. UFC 12 had to relocate from Niagara Falls, New York to Dauphin, Alabama as a result. I personally wouldn't want to fight in UFC, but as long as it's consensual, I think people should be able to do so. It's the same for people tripping on drugs in the street all day. I personally wouldn't do it, but it's their decision to do it with their lives, not mine. This is probably one of the biggest reasons why I would say I'm much more of a libertarian than a conservative. Faults. And I linked a tweet from Heidi Bruno. She said, "Conservatives fuck up when they jump from something is bad for me to make it illegal for all." And that she linked a tweet from Stone's also alcohol, a couple of glasses of wine with dinner made 4 times a year tops. One of the biggest myths permeated is that prohibition was failure. It was actually tremendous success. You learned about in school wrong. It's hip to be square. And I personally would agree it's hip to be square, but I don't think people should be forced to be square if they don't want to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And yeah, I think we're gonna wrap it up there, and I'll see you guys next episode. Bye.